Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There are legends whispered throughout the Imperium of man, tales of demigods who walked among mortals, warriors whose very presence could turn the tide of entire campaigns. Among these titans, one name carries a weight that transcends mere martial prowess. Vulkan, Lord of Drakes, the Promethean fire, stands not just as one of the 20 Primarchs created by the Emperor of mankind, but as something altogether unique in the annals of imperial history. When we speak of strength in the grim darkness of the far future, we must understand that power takes many forms. Some measure it in victories won, others in worlds conquered. But when discussing Vulkan, we delve into something more profound, more fundamental. This is the story of the only Primarch who could truly never die. Ed, the giant among giants, who combined unmatched physical might with a heart that burned for humanity itself. In the vast universe of Warhammer 40,000, where hope is a dying ember and darkness presses in from all sides, Vulkan represents something extraordinary. He is the Primarch of the Salamander's Legion, the 18th Legion of the Adeptus Astartes, but his significance extends far beyond command structure and military hierarchy. Among his brothers, the other Primarchs, who led humanity's great crusade across the stars, Vulkan possessed qualities that set him fundamentally apart. Where some Primarchs were tactical geniuses, others unstoppable warriors, and still others masters of politics and administration, Vulkan combined physical dominance with an almost supernatural resilience. He was, quite literally, the largest of all his brothers, as towering over even Horus in his Terminator armor, when Vulkan wore only his standard power armor. His strength was such that during sparring sessions with his fellow Primarchs, he deliberately held back, fearful that his full power might actually harm his superhuman siblings. But raw physical might, impressive as it was, tells only part of Vulkan's story. What truly elevates him above his brothers is a gift inherited from his father, the Emperor of mankind himself. Vulkan was a perpetual, a being blessed with cellular regeneration so profound that death itself could not claim him permanently. No matter how grievous the wound, no matter how complete the destruction of his physical form, Vulkan would return. This was not regeneration in the sense that other Primarchs could heal from terrible injuries. This was resurrection, and a defiance of mortality that placed Vulkan in a category entirely separate from even his superhuman brothers. While all Primarchs possessed durability far beyond mortal comprehension, only Vulkan could be beheaded, immolated, cast into the void of space, or obliterated by nuclear fire, and still rise again. This singular gift would define not just his role in the Imperium's history, but the very nature of his existence. The tale of Vulkan is one of fire and endurance, of strength tempered by compassion, of power wielded with restraint. It is a narrative that spans millennia, from his mysterious origins in the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains of ancient Terra, through his discovery on the volcanic death world of Nocturne, across the triumphs and tragedies of the Great Crusade, and into the horrors of the Horus heresy, and beyond into eras where most of his brothers had fallen to death or corruption. Unlike many Primarchs whose stories ended in the fires of civil war, Vulkan's legend extends across 10,000 years of imperial history, appearing at critical moments when the Imperium teetered on the brink of annihilation. His disappearances and returns have become the stuff of prophecy among his gene-sons, the Salamanders, who maintain an unwavering faith that their Primarch will return when humanity needs him most. Understanding Vulkan requires us to examine not just his martial achievements, though these were considerable, but the philosophy he embodied and instilled in his legion. In an Imperium, where human life was often considered the cheapest currency in the Emperor's vast empire, where entire planetary populations could be sacrificed without hesitation for strategic advantage, Vulkan insisted on something different. He taught that the strong had a duty to protect the weak, that civilians were not merely acceptable casualties, but lives worth preserving. This humanitarian approach, radical in the context of the Great Crusade's brutal efficiency, became the defining characteristic of the Salamander's Legion. Where other legions might level entire cities to eliminate a threat, the Salamanders would endure greater casualties themselves to preserve innocent lives. This was not weakness or sentimentality, but a conscious choice informed by Vulkan's own values, shaped by his upbringing among the hardy but compassionate people of Nocturne. The question of who is the strongest Primarch is one that has sparked countless debates among scholars and warriors alike. Some would point to Angron's berserker fury, others to Leman Russ's savage martial prowess, still others to Sanguinius's perfect balance of strength and skill. But when we speak of pure, raw physical strength, the answer is unambiguous. Vulkan stood alone. He could overturn Space Marine battle tanks with his bare hands, feats of strength that left even his enhanced brothers in awe. During the tournament on Nocturne, before he even knew his true heritage, Vulkan matched the Emperor of Mankind himself in contests of strength and endurance, with many trials ending in draws because neither being could establish clear superiority. This was the Emperor, the most powerful being humanity had ever produced, and young Vulkan on Nocturne could stand as his equal in matters of raw physical might. Yet strength without purpose is merely destruction waiting to happen. What made Vulkan truly formidable was the combination of his physical gifts with his keen intellect and masterful craftsmanship. He was perhaps the greatest artificer among the Primarchs, a smith whose creations were works of art as much as instruments of war. The weapons and armor he forged weren't simply well made. They were artifacts of such quality that they would become legendary treasures, sought after across millennia. Vulkan personally crafted weapons for several of his brother Primarchs, including the great Warhammer Dawnbringer, which he originally intended as a gift for Horus upon his elevation to War Master. His own arsenal included items of such potency that they had to be hidden away after the Horus heresy, lest they fall into the wrong hands and bring about catastrophe. The perpetual nature of Vulkan's existence also shaped his psychology in ways both profound and troubling. To be unable to die meant witnessing the deaths of everyone around him, watching brothers fall in battle, knowing they would never rise again, while he was condemned to return time and again. This burden of immortality would be tested most severely during his captivity by Conrad Curze, his brother Primarch, who had fallen to madness and cruelty. Curze, upon discovering Vulkan's perpetual nature, subjected him to tortures that would have broken any other being. He killed Vulkan in every conceivable way, beheading him, eviscerating him, casting him into space, burning him, crushing him, each time waiting for the inevitable resurrection before beginning anew. These experiences, while they could not destroy Vulkan's body, left scars on his psyche that would influence his actions throughout the remainder of his service to the Imperium. In the Chronicles of the Imperium, certain figures stand as pillars around which history itself seems to revolve. Vulkan is undoubtedly one of these pillars. His story interweaves with the greatest events of imperial history, from the glory days of the Great Crusade through the darkest hours of the Horus heresy and into the desperate struggles of later millennia. Unlike his brothers who died or disappeared never to return, Vulkan's perpetual nature means that his story is potentially never-ending. The Salamanders chapter maintains that their Primarch will return when all 9 of his sacred artifacts are recovered, a quest that continues to this day in the dying years of the 41st millennium. This prophecy gives the Salamanders hope in an age where hope is perhaps the rarest commodity in the galaxy. As we prepare to delve deeper into Vulkan's legend, we must remember that his tale is ultimately one of duty and sacrifice. He did not seek glory or conquest for their own sake. Unlike some of his brothers who reveled in warfare or the expansion of their own power, Vulkan viewed his role as one of protection and service. He was a guardian first and a warrior second, though he excelled at both. His legacy lives on not just in the chapter that bears his genetic legacy, but in the values he championed and the example he set. And in a universe where cruelty and brutality are often seen as necessary for survival, Vulkan demonstrated that strength could be tempered with mercy, that power could be wielded with restraint, and that the greatest victories were those that preserved life rather than merely ending it. This is the story of Vulkan, the strongest Primarch in Warhammer 40,000. It is a tale of fire and forge, of death and resurrection, of power beyond mortal comprehension, wielded in service of humanity's survival. From the volcanic plains of Nocturne to the corridors of the Imperial Palace, from the depths of the Webway to the battlefields of Ullanor, Vulkan's journey encompasses some of the most pivotal moments in Imperial history. His strength was legendary, his endurance supernatural, his compassion extraordinary. He was, in many ways, but the best of what the Emperor hoped to create when he began the Primarch project. And unlike so many of his brothers, Vulkan's story may not yet be finished. The discovery on Nocturne. The creation of the Primarchs stands as one of the Emperor's most ambitious undertakings, a genetic engineering project of staggering scope designed to create 20 perfect generals who would lead humanity's expansion across the stars. Deep within gene laboratories, hidden beneath the Himalayan mountains of terror, the Emperor crafted these beings from his own genetic template, imbuing each with a portion of his own vast powers and knowledge. Each Primarch was designed to embody specific aspects of the Emperor's nature, to excel in particular domains that would be necessary for the Great Crusade. But the dark gods of chaos, ever opposed to the Emperor's grand design, intervened at a critical moment in the Primarch's development. Through the machinations of these malevolent entities, the gestation capsules containing the infant Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy, each coming to rest on a different world. The capsule containing the Primarch, who would become known as Vulkan, fell from the warp onto the world of Nocturne, a harsh death world located in the Segmentum Ultima. The timing of his arrival was particularly unfortunate, as Nocturne was in the midst of what its inhabitants called the time of trial, a period of extreme volcanic and seismic activity that occurred when Nocturne's orbit brought it close to its sister planet, Prometheus. This proximity created gravitational stresses that triggered massive eruptions, earthquakes, and other natural catastrophes that tested the hardy colonists who called Nocturne home. It was into this crucible of fire and stone that the infant Primarch crashed, a blazing comet heralding the arrival of a being who would become synonymous with flame and endurance. The pod came down near a settlement called Hesiod, and it was here that a blacksmith named Bel discovered the child. Despite the chaos of the time of trial raging around them, Bel recognized something profound in this infant, something that resonated with the prophecies of the Promethean cult that was the spiritual heart of Nocturnian culture. The Promethean teachings spoke of a fire-born savior who would come to lead the people, and Bel believed he had found that prophesied child. He took the infant into his home and raised him as his own son. In naming him Vulkan, after the first king of the salamanders, the great reptilian creatures that were native to Nocturne and possessed an incredible resistance to fire and heat. What followed was a childhood that, while brief by normal standards, was extraordinary even by Primarch measures. Like all his brothers, Vulkan grew with supernatural speed, his body and mind developing at a rate that should have been impossible. Within 3 years of his arrival on Nocturne, Vulkan had grown to full adulthood, but this was no ordinary man's maturity. He stood taller and broader than any human on Nocturne, his frame massive and powerful, his strength beyond anything the hardy colonists had witnessed. But it was not merely his physical gifts that amazed the people of Hesiod. Vulkan's intellect proved equally prodigious. Bel was considered one of the finest smiths on Nocturne, his skill at the forge renowned across the settlements. Yet within months of beginning his training, young Vulkan had surpassed his adoptive father and was teaching techniques to the master craftsmen that they had never imagined. The people of Nocturne had long endured raids from a threat they called the Dusk Wraiths, shadowy attackers who came in the night to steal away the colonists for purposes too horrible to contemplate. In reality, these raiders were Dark Eldar, the most depraved and cruel faction of the ancient Eldari race, beings to whom suffering and pain were sources of pleasure and sustenance. For generations, the people of Nocturne had developed a culture of hiding when the dusk wraiths came, each person having prepared secret places where they might conceal themselves and hope to escape notice. It was an existence defined by fear and submission to an enemy they could not effectively fight. When Vulkan was in his 4th year on Nocturne, the Dark Eldar came again to Hesiod. But this raid would be different from all those that had come before. Rather than hide, Vulkan strode out into the center of the settlement, his 2 smithing hammers crossed over his broad shoulders, his eyes blazing with defiance. The sight of this towering figure, fearless in the face of the Xenos raiders, who had terrorized them for so long, stirred something in the hearts of Hesiod's people. If their champion would stand and fight, then they too would abandon fear and defend their homes, armed with whatever weapons they could find. As the colonists rallied around Vulkan and prepared to face their tormentors, the battle that followed entered immediately into Nocturnian legend. The Dark Eldar, expecting the usual cowering victims, instead found themselves facing organized resistance led by a being whose strength and speed surpassed even their own enhanced capabilities. Vulkan moved through their ranks like a force of nature, his hammers rising and falling with devastating effect. Every blow crushed armor and broke bodies. Every swing claimed another Xenos life. The Dark Eldar's poisoned blades, which could fell a normal human with the slightest scratch, sparked harmlessly off Vulkan's iron-hard flesh. His skin, already showing the dark, almost coal-black pigmentation that marked him as unique among Primarchs, seemed impervious to their weapons. And by the time the sun rose over Hesiod, Vulkan alone had slain 100 Dark Eldar warriors, and the survivors had fled back to their ships, their raid a complete failure for the first time in living memory. Word of this victory spread across Nocturne with the speed of wildfire. Within weeks, the headsmen of the 7 largest settlements on the planet had made the journey to Hesiod to meet this miracle warrior. When they arrived and witnessed Vulkan's prowess for themselves, they swore oaths that their people would never again hide from the dusk wraiths. Under Vulkan's example and leadership, Nocturne would transform from a world of fearful colonists into a society of warriors who would face any threat with courage and fire. The Dark Eldar raids on Nocturne did not cease entirely, but never again would the planet's people be easy prey. But Vulkan had not just defended one settlement, he had fundamentally altered the culture of an entire world. To celebrate Vulkan's triumph over the Xenos raiders, the people of Nocturne organized a grand tournament in the year 832 of the 30th Millennium. This would be a competition showcasing the values Nocturnians held most dear, with contests of strength, endurance, craftsmanship, and intellect. It was meant to honor their champion and allow him to demonstrate his superiority in every domain that mattered to their culture. But the tournament would become far more significant than anyone anticipated, for it would be the stage for Vulkan's reunion with his true father. A stranger arrived at the tournament, appearing seemingly from nowhere. He was pale-skinned, unlike the dark-complexioned people of Nocturne, and wore clothing that was utterly foreign to the colonists. Despite his unusual appearance, he requested permission to compete in the tournament, boldly claiming that he could best anyone present in any contest. The people laughed at this outlander's presumption. Who could possibly match Vulkan in feats of strength, endurance, intelligence, or skill? The stranger and Vulkan made a wager. Whoever lost the tournament would serve the victor for all time. What followed was 8 days of competition that would become the stuff of legend on Nocturne. Contest after contest was held, and in each one, Vulkan and the stranger proved evenly matched. In the anvil lift, where competitors had to hold massive anvils above their heads for as long as possible, both men held their burdens aloft for half a day before the contest was declared a draw. As in tests of craftsmanship, both produced works of such quality that judges could not determine a superior piece. In challenges of strength and endurance, again and again, The two competitors proved equals. The people of Nocturne watched in amazement as their champion, who they had thought unbeatable, found himself matched by this mysterious outlander. The final contest was decided to be a hunt. Each competitor would have 24 hours to forge a weapon, and then they would use that weapon to hunt and slay the largest salamander they could find. The great fire drakes of Nocturne were enormous reptilian creatures, resistant to heat and flame, incredibly dangerous and difficult to kill. Vulkan crafted a massive hammer, a weapon of his own design that combined his formidable strength with his mastery of metallurgy. The stranger produced a weapon as well, and both set out on their hunt. Vulkan tracked his prey through the volcanic highlands of Nocturne, finally cornering a massive salamander near one of the planet's many lava flows. The battle was fierce and long, testing even Vulkan's considerable strength and endurance. At the crucial moment, as he delivered the killing blow to the beast, a volcano erupted nearby with catastrophic force. The ground beneath Vulkan's feet gave way, and he found himself dangling from a cliff edge with one hand, holding onto the tail of the dead salamander with the other. The smart choice would have been to release the beast and save himself, but Vulkan's pride would not allow him to return empty-handed. He held on for hours as his strength slowly ebbed away, the weight of the massive reptile dragging him toward the molten rock below. Just as Vulkan's grip began to fail, when he knew he must choose between the prize and his life, the stranger appeared. He carried a salamander that was clearly larger than Vulkan's catch, meaning he had won the contest. But upon seeing Vulkan's peril, the stranger acted without hesitation. He hurled his own salamander's corpse into the lava flow between them, using the heat-resistant hide as a bridge to cross the molten river. Reaching Vulkan, he pulled the Primarch to safety, though this meant leaving his own prize to burn in the lava. When they returned to Hesiod, the judges prepared to declare Vulkan the winner, since he had returned with a salamander, while the stranger had not. But Vulkan silenced the crowd. He knelt before the stranger and spoke words that revealed the depth of his character. Any man who would value life over pride, Vulkan said, was worthy of his service. In that moment, the stranger cast off his illusory disguise and revealed his true form. The people of Nocturne found themselves in the presence of the Emperor of Mankind, the master of terror and architect of humanity's return to the stars. The Emperor explained to Vulkan his true origins, that he was not merely a gifted child, but a Primarch, one of 20 superhuman generals created to lead the Great Crusade. Bel and the people of Nocturne had raised him well, had taught him the values of craftsmanship and community, had shown him that strength should be used to protect rather than dominate. These lessons, the Emperor told Vulkan, were exactly what he needed to learn. And unlike some of his brothers who had been raised as conquerors or politicians, Vulkan had learned to be a guardian and an artisan. These were the qualities the Emperor hoped to instill in all his Primarchs, and Vulkan embodied them naturally. The reunion between Vulkan and the Emperor was not immediately followed by the Primarch taking command of his legion. Unlike many of his brothers who were quickly placed at the head of their forces, Vulkan spent years studying under the Emperor directly, learning about the Imperium, understanding the broader strategic situation facing humanity, and preparing himself for the enormous responsibility of leading one of the Emperor's Space Marine legions. This extended period of tutelage was unusual, suggesting that the Emperor had specific plans for Vulkan, or recognized that he needed special preparation. When Vulkan was finally reunited with his legion, the circumstances were appropriately dramatic. The 18th Legion, originally known as the Dragon Warriors, had been deployed to the Aridus system to combat a massive invasion by greenskins. The green-skinned Xenos had gathered in numbers that threatened to overwhelm the undermanned legion. Just when the situation seemed most desperate, Vulkan arrived at the head of a fleet carrying 3,000 new recruits, all drawn from Nocturne and raised to be space marines using Vulkan's own genetic legacy. These warriors brought with them not just numbers, but also weapons and war machines crafted to Vulkan's exacting specifications. They fell upon the greenskin forces like a thunderbolt, and under Vulkan's leadership, the Xenos threat was utterly annihilated. In honor of the contest that had united Vulkan with his father, and to commemorate the creatures that were so central to Nocturnian culture, the 18th Legion was renamed the Salamanders. They would take as their symbol the great fire drake, and they would embody their Primarch's values of strength, endurance, and protection of the innocent. Under Vulkan's command, the Salamanders' Legion would go on to fight in countless campaigns across the galaxy, earning a reputation that was unique among the Emperor's forces. They were known as fierce warriors, certainly, but also as space marines who cared about the fates of the common people they were ostensibly protecting. In an age of total war where collateral damage was simply accepted as a necessary cost, the Salamanders tried to fight differently. While the discovery on Nocturne had shaped Vulkan in ways that would define not just his own character, but the entire culture of the Legion he led. The lessons learned in Inbel's Forge, the values absorbed from the hardy colonists of Hesiod, the example of protecting the weak against predatory Xenos, all of these experiences created a Primarch who was fundamentally different from most of his brothers. Where others saw civilians as obstacles or acceptable losses, Vulkan saw people worth protecting. Where others might level a city to eliminate a threat, Vulkan sought ways to preserve innocent lives, even at the cost of tactical efficiency. This humanitarian approach would sometimes put him at odds with other Primarchs and Imperial commanders, but it also earned him the undying loyalty of his sons and the respect of the common citizens who witnessed the Salamanders in action. Physical prowess and immortality. Among the 20 Primarchs created by the Emperor of Mankind, each possessed abilities that placed them far beyond mortal comprehension. These were beings who could think faster than cogitators could calculate, who could process information and make tactical decisions in microseconds, whose strength could shatter ceramite and whose speed could blur the line between movement and teleportation. Yet even among these demigods, certain Primarchs stood out in specific domains. Robut Guilliman was unmatched in his organizational and administrative abilities. Magnus the Red possessed psychic might that bordered on the divine. Lionel Johnson's tactical acumen was legendary. And Vulkan, the Lord of Drakes, stood alone in the realm of pure physical strength and supernatural endurance. The physical dimensions of Vulkan were themselves remarkable. Even among his superhuman brothers, he was notable for his size. Standing well over 10 feet tall, Vulkan towered above normal humans and space marines alike. But what made his stature truly extraordinary was how he compared to his fellow Primarchs. It was recorded in Imperial chronicles that Vulkan in his standard power armor stood as tall as Horus, the War Master, and perhaps the most renowned of all Primarchs, when Horus wore his much larger and more imposing Terminator plate. This meant that in actual physical size, Vulkan exceeded even Horus, who was himself considered massive among his brothers. Only Magnus the Red, whose form was mutable and could change size at will through psychic powers, could match or exceed Vulkan's dimensions, but Magnus's size was a product of sorcery rather than actual physical mass. The breadth of Vulkan's shoulders, the thickness of his limbs, the sheer density of his musculature, all contributed to a frame that was built for power. Unlike some Primarchs, whose builds suggested speed or agility, Vulkan's body was clearly designed for raw strength. His hands could engulf a human skull entirely, his fingers able to crush stone as easily as a mortal might crumble dry earth. Witnesses to Vulkan's strength reported feats that strained belief, even accounting for the superhuman nature of the Primarchs. During battles in the Great Crusade, Vulkan was observed literally overturning Space Marine battle tanks with his bare hands. He lifting these armored vehicles that weighed many tons and using them as weapons or barriers. This was not leverage or technique, it was pure brute strength applied to mass that should have been immovable. During sparring sessions with his brother Primarchs, a tradition that allowed the Emperor's sons to test themselves against each other and hone their combat skills, Vulkan deliberately held back his full strength. This restraint was not born of arrogance but of genuine concern. Several of his brothers commented that when fighting Vulkan, they could feel the Salamander's Primarch pulling his blows, consciously limiting the power behind his strikes. Vulkan himself admitted in private conversations that he feared accidentally injuring his siblings if he fought with his full might. Yet consider what this means. A being capable of being worried about hurting other Primarchs, creatures who could individually fight their way through armies, who could survive wounds that would kill dozens of normal men. The implication is staggering. Vulkan's maximum strength was such that even his superhuman brothers might be vulnerable to it. The contest with the Emperor on Nocturne provides perhaps the best objective measure of Vulkan's physical capabilities. When the disguised Emperor competed against Vulkan in various tests of strength and endurance, many of these trials ended in draws. The two beings held massive anvils aloft for half a day, neither able to outlast the other. They wrestled and struggled in tests of raw power, with neither able to establish clear dominance. This was the Emperor, the most powerful human being ever to exist, master of armies and creator of the Primarchs themselves, and Vulkan as a young man on Nocturne could match him in purely physical contests. While it's true the Emperor was likely holding back some of his vast psychic might, focusing only on physical strength, the fact remains that in this limited domain, Vulkan proved himself the Emperor's equal. But impressive as Vulkan's strength was, it was his supernatural resilience and regenerative capabilities that truly set him apart from all his brothers. Vulkan was a perpetual, a rare type of human mutant that possessed cellular regeneration so profound as to make death itself temporary. This was not the enhanced healing that all Primarchs enjoyed, the ability to recover from injuries that would kill normal men. This was resurrection, and the power to return from complete physical destruction. Vulkan could be killed in any manner imaginable. His body could be utterly destroyed down to ash and charred bone, and given time, he would reform and return to life.
You know, I've been covering Warhammer lore for a while now, and I have to say, Vulkan hits different for me. There's something deeply tragic about his story that doesn't get talked about enough. Imagine being the only one who literally cannot die, watching every single person you care about fall in battle, knowing they'll never come back the way you do. That's not a gift, that's a curse. And yet, he never became bitter or cruel like Cruzy did. He kept that humanity alive for 10,000 years. That's what makes him truly the strongest, in my opinion. Not the physical power, but that unbreakable spirit. But anyway, let's get back to it.
This ability was so rare that only a handful of beings in all of human history possessed it, the Emperor chief among them. The perpetual nature was, according to the lore, a specific gift the Emperor had intentionally engineered into Vulkan's genetic makeup. Of all his Primarch sons, only Vulkan received this blessing, though the Emperor himself possessed it naturally. The question of why the Emperor chose to give this ability to Vulkan specifically, and why he did not extend it to his other sons, has been a subject of much speculation among Imperial scholars. And some theories suggest it was because the Emperor foresaw that Vulkan would need this resilience for a specific purpose later in history. Others propose that the perpetual gene could not be reliably replicated in all Primarchs, and Vulkan was the only one whose genetic structure could support it. Still others believe it was because the Emperor recognized that Vulkan's compassionate nature meant he would use immortality responsibly, rather than seeing it as license for reckless behavior. Vulkan himself remained unaware of his perpetual nature for many years. During his time on Nocturne, and throughout much of the Great Crusade, he simply believed himself to be an exceptionally resilient Primarch, able to shrug off injuries that might slow his brothers. The true nature of his gift was not revealed until the horrors of Istvan V, and during the Dropsite massacre that marked one of the opening tragedies of the Horus Heresy, when the Iron Warriors fleet unleashed tactical nuclear weapons on the Salamander's Legion. The blast that should have vaporized Vulkan instead became the catalyst for his first remembered death and resurrection. The explosion that killed thousands of his sons reduced Vulkan's body to little more than carbonized remains, yet he did not die. His body regenerated from this catastrophic damage, healing wounds that by all rights should have ended any life, even one as enhanced as a Primarch's. This discovery came at a terrible cost, for it was during his regeneration that Vulkan fell into the hands of Konrad Curze, his brother Primarch, who had embraced madness and cruelty. Curze, upon learning of Vulkan's perpetual nature, he subjected him to tortures that defy description. The Night Haunter killed Vulkan again and again, exploring the limits of his brother's resurrection ability with the methodical thoroughness of a scientist conducting experiments, though his motivations were far more sadistic. Kurzi beheaded Vulkan, watching as the salamander's Primarch's head regrew. He ripped Vulkan's throat out with a dining fork, waited for the tissue to regenerate, and killed him in another fashion. He stabbed him through the heart, tore him limb from limb, eviscerated him, shot him with hundreds of bolter rounds at point-blank range, threw him into the ventilation shaft of a starship's engine, and even cast him naked into the airless void of space. Each death was horrific, and each time Vulkan returned. But the resurrections were not instant, nor were they easy. The regeneration process took time, sometimes hours, or even days depending on the severity of the damage. During this period, Vulkan's consciousness remained aware, experiencing the agony of tissues knitting back together, of organs reforming, of bones regrowing from shattered fragments. It was torture not just of the body, but of the mind, a violation of the natural order that took a profound psychological toll. Kurzi's torments were designed not just to kill Vulkan repeatedly, but to break his spirit, to drive him mad through the trauma of endless death and resurrection. For months, this torture continued, with Vulkan dying and returning in an endless cycle of agony. Yet Vulkan's will proved as unbreakable as his body's ability to regenerate, despite the horrors inflicted upon him. And despite the psychological trauma of dying over and over again, he never truly broke. His spirit, tempered in the forges of Nocturne and hardened by his dedication to duty, endured. When he finally escaped Kurzi's clutches and crash-landed on Macraga, Vulkan carried the scars of his ordeal not on his perpetually regenerating body, but in his memories and his soul. The experience taught him the true nature of his gift and its terrible price. He could not die, but that meant he would outlive everyone around him, watching his sons fall in battle, knowing they would never return as he did. The perpetual ability also came with other unique properties. Vulkan possessed complete immunity to fire and heat, able to walk through flames that would reduce even ceramite to slag without suffering any harm. Yet his skin could withstand temperatures that would melt most metals. This made him uniquely suited to combat in volcanic environments or against enemies who used flame-based weapons. During battles, Vulkan could stride through raging infernos to reach his foes, his massive form emerging from the flames like an avatar of the god for whom he was named. This resistance to heat extended beyond mere physical immunity. It was as if fire recognized Vulkan as kin and refused to harm him. The combination of Vulkan's size, strength, and immortality created a warrior of truly terrifying capabilities. In battle, he could afford to take risks that would be suicidal for others, knowing that even if the gambit failed and he fell, he would return. This made him unpredictable and extraordinarily difficult to stop. And enemies who thought they had slain the great Primarch would discover, sometimes days or weeks later, that he had risen again and was coming for them with renewed fury. The psychological impact of facing an opponent who literally could not be killed permanently was profound. How do you fight something that death cannot claim? Yet Vulkan never allowed his immortality to make him reckless or to devalue the lives of others. Unlike some hypothetical immortal who might become callous about mortality, Vulkan's inability to die seemed to make him cherish life more deeply. He knew what it was to experience death repeatedly, to feel consciousness fade and return, and this knowledge made him all the more determined to spare others from that fate when possible. His perpetual nature made him acutely aware of how precious and fragile mortal life was, even as it exempted him personally from mortality's final claim. The strength and resilience of Vulkan's body reflected in the weapons and armor he crafted for himself. His Warhammer Dawnbringer was forged to withstand the tremendous forces Vulkan could generate with his blows, forces that would shatter lesser weapons. His armor, the Draken Scale, was built to protect a body that was significantly larger than even other Primarch's frames, incorporating the skull of the great fire drake Kasare as both ornamentation and additional protection. Every piece of his war gear was sized and reinforced for someone of Vulkan's unique dimensions and strength, making his equipment distinct even among Primarch artifacts. In the annals of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, stories of Vulkan's strength became legendary. Then witnesses reported seeing him charge through entire gun lines of traitor legionaries, shrugging off bolter fire that would have shredded lighter armored opponents, closing to melee range, where his strength could be fully unleashed. They spoke of seeing him lift fallen land raiders to create cover for his troops, or tear through bulkheads and armored doors that were meant to be impenetrable. His grip could crush power armor. His blows could shatter the heaviest siege shields. His momentum when charging could bowl over enemy formations like a tsunami crashing against a shoreline. When Vulkan fought his brother Primarch Magnus the Red during the Siege of Terra, the battle showcased both his physical might and his perpetual nature. Magnus, desperate to complete a ritual that would weaken the Emperor, attempted to kill Vulkan using every psychic power at his disposal. The Crimson King beheaded Vulkan with a khopesh, watched him regenerate, then suffocated him by turning his lungs to amber, saw him breathe again, drained him of all his blood, witnessed him heal, and immolated him with psychic fire hot enough to reduce ceramite to vapor, only to see Vulkan's charred form rise once more. No matter what Magnus tried, Vulkan kept coming, kept hammering at the psychic barriers protecting the traitor Primarch, kept fighting with a determination that eventually wore down even Magnus's formidable powers. It was a battle of attrition where one combatant literally could not lose through death, and Magnus learned too late that even a demon Primarch's abilities had limits when faced with an opponent who would never stay down. On the physical prowess and supernatural resilience of Vulkan defined him as perhaps the ultimate survivor among the Primarchs. Where others might fall to a lucky shot or an overwhelming assault, Vulkan endured. His strength allowed him to overcome obstacles through raw power when finesse failed. His immortality meant that defeat was always temporary, that setbacks were never permanent. Yet he bore these gifts not with arrogance, but with solemn responsibility, understanding that his abilities came with the duty to protect those who lacked such advantages. In Vulkan, the Emperor had created not just a weapon of unparalleled durability, but a guardian who would endure through the ages, returning whenever humanity's need was greatest. The Salamander's Legion and Philosophy. When Vulkan assumed command of what had been the Dragon Warriors, in the 18th Legion of the Adeptus Astartes, he inherited a fighting force that had already established a respectable record during the early years of the Great Crusade. However, these warriors had been created from his genetic material without his guidance, shaped by the doctrines and practices that prevailed throughout the wider Astartes forces. What Vulkan brought to his sons was not merely tactical expertise or leadership, but a fundamental transformation of their identity and purpose. Under his command, the renamed Salamander's Legion would become something unique among the Emperor's Space Marines, a force that combined the terrifying martial prowess expected of the Astartes with a humanitarian philosophy that was almost unheard of in the brutal calculus of the Great Crusade. The renaming ceremony that transformed the Dragon Warriors into the Salamanders was rich with symbolism. The great fire drakes of Nocturne were creatures of legend on Vulkan's homeworld, massive reptilian beings that dwelt in the volcanic regions and possessed an almost supernatural resistance to heat and flame. They were fierce when threatened, capable of breathing gouts of fire that could melt stone, yet they were also protective of their territory and their young. The Salamanders represented strength married to purpose, power used in defense rather than mere destruction. By taking these creatures as their symbol and namesake, Vulkan's Legion was making a statement about what kind of warriors they would be. The culture of Nocturne itself became deeply embedded in the Legion's identity. Unlike many Astartes chapters that drew recruits from multiple worlds or specific hive cities designed to produce warriors, the Salamanders maintained a strong connection to their Primarch's homeworld. Nocturnian culture valued craftsmanship, community, and resilience in the face of adversity. These were not a people who had conquered their planet through military might, but had survived it through cooperation and skill. The harsh conditions of Nocturne, with its volcanic activity and dangerous fauna, had created a society that understood both the value of strength and the importance of using that strength to protect rather than dominate. When young men from Nocturne were recruited into the Salamanders, they brought these cultural values with them, creating a legion whose martial ferocity was tempered by a deep-rooted sense of duty to those they protected. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Salamanders' philosophy was their approach to civilians and collateral damage. In the brutal arithmetic of the Great Crusade, human lives were often treated as the cheapest resource in the Imperium's vast arsenal. Entire planetary populations could be sacrificed to draw out an enemy, cities leveled to deny resources to opponents, civilians displaced or killed with barely a second thought if it served the strategic objectives of a campaign. This was not casual cruelty, but calculated efficiency, the cold logic of total war, waged across galactic scales where individual lives vanished into statistical insignificance. Many Primarchs and their legions accepted this reality without question, and viewing civilian casualties as regrettable but inevitable costs of expansion and conquest. Vulkan rejected this calculus. He taught his sons that the strong had a duty to protect the weak, that the power of the Astartes should be used to shield the innocent, rather than expending them as convenient tools. This was not mere sentiment, but a fundamental philosophical position about what the Great Crusade was supposed to achieve. The Emperor's vision, as Vulkan understood it, was to unite humanity and usher in an age of enlightenment and prosperity. How could this be accomplished if the forces of unification treated human populations as disposable resources? What value was there in conquering worlds if those worlds were left devastated wastelands, populated by traumatized survivors who had every reason to hate their supposed liberators? But the practical implementation of this philosophy meant that Salamander's operations often took longer and cost more in terms of Astartes' casualties than equivalent actions by other legions. Where the Night Lords might massacre an entire city to terrorize a world into compliance, the Salamanders would fight building by building to neutralize military targets while evacuating civilians. Where the World Eaters might charge directly through populated areas in their berserker fury, the Salamanders would plan their assaults to minimize collateral damage, even if it meant taking more difficult routes or exposing themselves to greater enemy fire. This approach was expensive in both time and blood, but Vulkan considered it the only acceptable way to wage war in service of humanity's future. The Promethean Creed, the philosophical and quasi-religious doctrine that guided the Salamanders, emerged from the intersection of Nocturnian beliefs and Vulkan's teachings. At its heart was the concept of the Circle of Fire, a philosophical framework that encompassed ideas about death, rebirth, transformation, and duty. The creed taught that in death, individuals return to the ash from which they came, their remains bonded with the earth through fire, experiencing a form of rebirth. This was not necessarily literal reincarnation, though some interpreted it that way, but rather a metaphor for the cyclical nature of existence and the transformation that comes through trial and hardship, much as metal is transformed and strengthened through the forging process. Fire in Salamander's philosophy was both literal and metaphorical. Literally, our fire was the element through which Nocturnian smiths transformed raw ore into finished weapons and tools. It was the crucible in which strength was forged, the medium through which change occurred. Metaphorically, fire represented trials, challenges, the hardships that tested individuals and either consumed them or tempered them into something stronger. Just as metal must be heated to be shaped, humans must face difficulties to develop character and resilience. The Salamanders saw themselves as forged in the fires of adversity, shaped by their experiences into weapons that would serve the Imperium, but weapons with purpose and direction rather than mindless instruments of destruction. The emphasis on craftsmanship within the Salamander's Legion was more than mere tradition inherited from Vulkan's own skills as a smith. It was a philosophical commitment to the idea that effort, skill, and care mattered. Every salamander was expected to master some form of craftsmanship, whether that was weaponsmithing, armor maintenance, or some other technical skill. They maintained and repaired their own equipment personally, seeing it not as menial labor to be delegated to serfs, but as a sacred duty. A warrior who could create, repair, and improve his war gear understood its capabilities and limitations in ways that a warrior who simply used whatever was provided could never match. This hands-on approach created a legion of technically proficient combatants who could operate effectively even when cut off from supply lines or support, able to maintain their equipment in the field and even fabricate repairs from available materials. But the relationship between Vulkan and his sons was notably different from the dynamic many other Primarchs had with their legions. Vulkan did not see himself as a distant demigod to be worshipped or feared, but rather as a father figure and teacher. He trained alongside his warriors, worked at the forges beside them, shared their dangers in battle rather than merely directing from a command throne. This approachability, combined with his genuine concern for their welfare, inspired a fierce loyalty among the salamanders that went beyond the programmed obedience built into Space Marine psychology. They fought for Vulkan not just because he was their Primarch, but because they loved him and believed in the values he embodied. There were times when Vulkan's humanitarian approach put him in conflict with other Primarchs and Imperial commanders. The most notable early example occurred during the campaign to bring the world-designated 1546, locally known as Karatan, into compliance. The Salamanders were operating alongside the Night Lord's Legion, led by Conrad Kurz, and also supported by elements of the Mechanicum and Imperial Army. As the campaign progressed, Vulkan became increasingly disturbed by the Night Lord's methods. Kurz and his sons waged war through terror, massacring civilians to break the will of their enemies, committing atrocities designed to spread fear rather than to achieve military objectives. When Vulkan discovered that the Night Lords had exterminated the entire population of one city simply to intimidate other settlements, he confronted Kurz directly. The argument between Vulkan and Kurz revealed fundamental differences in their worldviews. Kurz believed that fear was the most efficient tool of control, that one act of overwhelming brutality could prevent prolonged resistance and ultimately save lives by ending conflicts quickly. He saw Vulkan's approach as naive and wasteful, prolonging campaigns and costing loyal soldiers' lives in order to preserve civilians who might turn against the Imperium anyway. Vulkan countered that terror tactics created enemies rather than loyal subjects, that populations brutalized into submission would rebel at the first opportunity, and that the Imperium was supposed to be building a better future for humanity, not ruling through fear and oppression. Neither Primarch could convince the other, and the confrontation planted seeds of enmity that would later factor into the horrors Vulkan endured during the Horus Heresy. After Karatan, Vulkan reported Kurz's conduct to Warmaster Horus and to Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists. This was not petty tattling, but a genuine concern that the Night Lord's methods were counterproductive and reflected poorly on what the Great Crusade was supposed to represent. The complaint was noted, but ultimately led nowhere, as Kurz's results, however brutal his methods, were effective in the crude metric of worlds brought into compliance. This incident highlighted a broader tension within the Crusade between those who prioritized efficiency and results versus those who cared about the means used to achieve those results. Vulkan stood firmly in the latter camp, willing to accept slower progress and higher costs if it meant fighting in a way that aligned with his values. Despite their humanitarian focus, but the Salamanders were not weak or ineffective warriors. In battle, they demonstrated the same ferocity and skill as any other legion. Their preference for close-range combat and flame weapons made them particularly terrifying opponents. A salamander's assault often began with gouts of promethium fire that incinerated enemy positions, followed by armored warriors charging through the flames that would have stopped other forces. The sight of space marines emerging from raging infernos, their armor blackened by heat but undamaged, weapons raised for close combat, broke the morale of countless enemies. The salamanders' resistance to fire meant they could operate in environments that would be lethal to other forces, from the burning deserts of Deathworlds to the interior of ships or structures that were actively aflame. The Legion's tactics favored deliberate, methodical advances that secured territory comprehensively rather than flashy deep strikes or lightning assaults. This approach reflected Vulkan's craftsman mentality, the belief that something worth doing was worth doing properly, with attention to detail and thoroughness. Salamander's forces would clear areas completely before advancing, ensuring that bypassed enemies couldn't attack their supply lines or strike at civilians under their protection. This made them excellent at defensive operations and urban warfare, where the safety of non-combatants was a concern. Other legions might be deployed for rapid conquest or shock assaults, but when a campaign required precision and the minimization of civilian casualties, the Salamanders were the ideal choice. But the organization of the Salamanders reflected their Nocturnian heritage, with units often maintaining close ties to specific settlements on their home world. Unlike some legions that sought to erase recruits' previous identities and forge them into standardized warriors, the Salamanders encouraged their members to maintain connections to their origins. Astartes, who had come from the same settlement or region of Nocturne, often served together, creating bonds that went back to their lives before recruitment. This emphasis on community and connection created a legion that fought not as individuals who happened to wear the same colors, but as a brotherhood in the truest sense of the word. Even after battles were won, the Salamanders often remained in theater longer than other legions, assisting with reconstruction efforts and ensuring that conquered or liberated worlds had stable governments and functioning infrastructure before moving on. This was unusual behavior for Astartes' forces, whose purpose was conquest and warfare rather than nation-building. Yet Vulkan insisted that the Great Crusade's success would be measured not just in worlds conquered, but in worlds successfully integrated into the Imperium, with populations that identified as imperial citizens rather than conquered subjects. The time his legion spent on post-battle stabilization was, in his view, as important as the time spent in actual combat. The Salamander's humanitarian philosophy would face its greatest test during the Dropsite massacre at Istvan V, where Vulkan's insistence on protecting his sons and fighting honorably would contribute to the catastrophic losses his legion suffered. When the trap was sprung and the supposed loyalist legions revealed their treachery, the Salamanders found themselves caught in a killing field with limited options for survival. Where a more ruthless legion might have abandoned their injured or cut their way out without regard for losses, Vulkan and his sons tried to evacuate wounded, maintain unit cohesion, and protect one another even as the situation became increasingly hopeless. Their compassion became a liability in a scenario where cold pragmatism might have saved more lives. Yet even in retrospect, Vulkan never regretted fighting in accordance with his values rather than compromising them for tactical advantage. The legacy of Vulkan's philosophy continues in the Salamanders chapter that exists in the 41st millennium, 10,000 years after the Horus heresy. They remain one of the few Astartes chapters that actively maintains ties to civilian populations, that recruits from a single world and preserves cultural connections to that world, and that prioritizes the protection of innocence in their combat doctrine. In an age where the Imperium has become grotesquely authoritarian and life is cheaper than ever, the Salamander's humanitarian approach is an anomaly, a reminder of what the Emperor's vision might have been before it was corrupted by millennia of warfare and political decay. They are living proof that strength and compassion need not be mutually exclusive, that warriors can be both fierce and merciful, weapons and artifacts and craftsmanship. To understand Vulkan properly, one must appreciate his nature not just as a warrior, but as an artificer of extraordinary skill. Among all the Primarchs, each blessed with superhuman capabilities and knowledge across numerous domains, Vulkan stood apart as the master craftsman. Where his brothers might commission the finest weapons and armor from the tech priests of Mars, Vulkan forged his own, and in doing so created artifacts that would become legendary across the millennia. His works were not mere tools, but masterpieces that combine technical perfection with aesthetic beauty, weapons that seem to contain within them some spark of their creator's indomitable will. The hammer strikes that shaped adamantium and ceramite in Vulkan's forge were driven by the same strength that could overthrow battle tanks. And the intellect that designed each piece was that of a being who had mastered sciences that took mortal tech priests lifetimes to even partially comprehend. The centerpiece of Vulkan's arsenal for most of the Great Crusade was the warhammer known as Dawnbringer. This was no ordinary weapon, even by the standards of Primarch wargear. Dawnbringer was massive, so large and heavy that no being save a Primarch could hope to lift it, let alone wield it effectively in combat. The hammer's head was forged from materials so durable that they could strike with the force Vulkan could generate without shattering or deforming. The weapons of Primarchs had to be impossibly resilient because the beings who wielded them could generate forces that would destroy lesser implements. Dawnbringer met this requirement, able to withstand blows that would shatter any normal hammer while delivering devastating impacts to whatever it struck. But Dawnbringer was more than just a supremely durable bludgeon. Built into the weapon was a teleportation device of Vulkan's own design, allowing the Primarch to transport himself across vast distances, even to distant planets if necessary. This made Dawnbringer not just a weapon, but a strategic asset, giving Vulkan mobility that few of his brothers could match without access to specialized equipment or psychic powers. The combination of devastating melee capability and tactical teleportation made Dawnbringer one of the most versatile Primarch weapons ever created. Vulkan originally crafted Dawnbringer as a gift for Horus upon his elevation to the rank of Warmaster, intending it as a symbol of unity and a tool the Warmaster could use to lead the Great Crusade. However, when Vulkan sensed darkness within Horus during their meeting, he withheld the gift, an instinctive decision that proved prescient when Horus later betrayed the Emperor. When Dawnbringer was lost during the Dropsite massacre at Istvan V, Vulkan would later forge a new hammer called Doomtremor during his return for the War of the Beast. Doomtremor was even larger than its predecessor, so massive that even a Space Marine in Terminator armor could not lift it. This weapon was specifically designed for the battle Vulkan knew was coming, a confrontation with the Beast, the greatest greenskin war boss the galaxy had seen since the Emperor himself defeated the warlord on Ullanor who had first unified the Green Tide. A Doomtremor would prove its worth in that final battle, delivering the killing blow to the Beast, even as it contributed to Vulkan's own apparent destruction. Perhaps the most powerful weapon Vulkan ever created was Urdrakule, a two-headed thunderhammer of such potency that its very existence was a matter of legend and fear. Unlike Dawnbringer or Doomtremor, which Vulkan crafted deliberately according to his own designs, Urdrakule was forged during a period when Vulkan was in an altered state, guided by psychic communion with the Emperor himself. The result was a weapon that transcended normal physical limits. Urdrakule possessed the power to permanently kill entities that should have been immortal, to give true death to demons that would normally simply reform in the warp after being destroyed in the material universe. When Vulkan wielded Urdrakule, he killed a greater demon of Nurgle, one of the most powerful servants of the Plague God, and gave it true death from which it could never return. This feat alone demonstrated that Urdrakule was not merely a weapon, but an instrument of cosmic significance. The hammer was so powerful that it could shatter even the living metal arms of Ferrus Manus, Vulkan's brother Primarch, whose hands had been transformed into an indestructible metallic substance after he slew a dragon-like creature on Medusa and plunged his hands into its molten metal blood. Those arms could not be damaged by any conventional weapon, yet Urdrakule could break them. This suggested that the hammer contained not just physical destructive power, but some quality that transcended the normal rules of material existence. Given its origin in psychic communion with the Emperor, and its ability to inflict true death on otherwise immortal beings, Urdrakule likely contained a fragment of the Emperor's own psychic might, shaped and focused through Vulkan's unmatched craftsmanship into a form that could destroy that which should be imperishable. Vulkan's personal armor, the Draken Scale, was a marvel of artifice in its own right. Unlike the standardized power armor worn by Space Marines, or even the more elaborate suits many Primarchs commissioned from the forges of Mars, the Draken Scale was entirely custom-built to accommodate Vulkan's unique physiology and requirements. The armor incorporated the skull of Kasare, the great fire drake that Vulkan had hunted during his contest with the Emperor, while mounted prominently and serving both as ornamentation and as additional protection. The image of this skull would become the symbol of the Salamander's Legion, a constant reminder of their Primarch's origins and the trial that had revealed the Emperor's identity. The Draken Scale provided exceptional protection, even by Primarch standards, able to withstand weapons that would penetrate lighter armor. But its most remarkable feature was how it complemented Vulkan's natural immunity to heat and flame. The armor could operate in environments that would reduce lesser suits to molten slag, walking through promethium fires or volcanic eruptions without degradation. This made Vulkan capable of operating in zones that would be lethal to any other combatant, emerging from infernos that served as absolute barriers to normal forces. The psychological impact of seeing an enemy as massive as Vulkan striding through flames that incinerated everything they touched, completely unharmed and advancing with implacable purpose, shattered the morale of countless foes. Among the components of the Draken Scale was an item that would become one of the sacred artifacts the Salamanders would later search for across the galaxy. The Gauntlet of the Forge was an armored gauntlet incorporating a heavy flamer, allowing Vulkan to project gouts of burning promethium at enemies while keeping his hands free for melee combat or other tasks. The integration of the flame weapon into the gauntlet itself, rather than mounting it as a separate weapon, demonstrated Vulkan's sophisticated understanding of both weapon design and ergonomics. When Vulkan wore the gauntlet, while the heavy flamer became as natural an extension of his arm as his own hand, able to be brought to bear with thought rather than requiring the kind of careful aiming that separate weapons demanded. Another component of Vulkan's standard war gear that would become a sought-after relic was Kasare's mantle, a cloak woven from the scales of the great fire drake. These scales possessed the same supernatural resistance to heat that the living creature had enjoyed, making the mantle nearly impenetrable and completely fireproof. Beyond its defensive properties, Kasare's mantle served as a symbol of Vulkan's connection to Nocturne and the traditions of his adopted homeworld. The practice of hunting great beasts and crafting items from their remains was central to Nocturnian culture, and Vulkan's wearing of the mantle demonstrated that for all his status as a Primarch and commander of a legion, he remained at heart a son of Nocturne. The Spear of Vulkan was another of his masterwork creations, a power weapon that burned with such intense heat that it could set fire to and melt through even ceramite, the advanced armor material used in Space Marine plate. The spear combined the cutting power of a traditional power weapon's disruption field with thermal effects that exceeded those of standard weapons by orders of magnitude. When Vulkan thrust with this spear, he was not merely penetrating armor through physical force or molecular disruption, but actually melting through it, creating wounds that cauterized instantly from the intense heat. It was said that only a Primarch could harness the spear's true power, that the weapon was so potent that anyone of lesser strength attempting to wield it would find it uncontrollable or even dangerous to the user. Vulkan also crafted a weapon called the Furnace's Heart, which was given to him by his brother Ferrus Manus, but may have been designed based on principles Vulkan had shared with the Iron Hand's Primarch. This weapon was similar in operation to a plasma pistol, but far more powerful, firing individual supercharged shells that could produce laser-like blasts, capable of annihilating large numbers of heavily armored foes in a single shot. The Furnace's Heart represented the bleeding edge of weapons technology, a handheld device that could produce destructive output normally associated with much larger vehicle-mounted weapons. Now, what set Vulkan's creations apart was not just their power, but their reliability and craftsmanship. Weapons forged by Vulkan didn't fail, didn't jam, didn't suffer the kind of mechanical problems that plagued even the finest work of other artificers. This was partly a function of his superhuman precision and understanding of materials, but it also reflected a philosophical commitment to excellence. When Vulkan created something, whether a weapon of war or a simple tool, he invested in it the full measure of his skill and attention. There was no such thing as a quick project or good enough craftsmanship in Vulkan's forge. Everything was built to the highest possible standard, as if he was creating not just a functional object, but a work of art that would endure through the ages. This perfectionism extended to weapons Vulkan forged for others. He created masterwork items for several of his brother Primarchs, understanding their fighting styles and preferences well enough to craft weapons uniquely suited to each recipient. These were not generic gifts, but personalized creations that reflected both the recipient's nature and Vulkan's relationship with them. The care and thought invested in these gifts demonstrated Vulkan's character, his desire to strengthen his brothers and support them in their duties, even when he disagreed with some of their methods. The vault on Prometheus, where Vulkan stored thousands of his creations before the Horus heresy, represented an arsenal of apocalyptic potential. Each item in that vault was a masterwork, from simple blades of surpassing quality to god machines of terrible power. When Vulkan ordered the first Forge Father, Tekel, to destroy most of these weapons, it was not because they were failures, but because he recognized their danger. The rebellion of Horus had demonstrated that even the best and most trusted could fall to corruption. If Primarchs could turn traitor, then any weapon might eventually be used for evil, regardless of the intentions of its creator. Better to destroy his life's work than risk those creations being turned against the Imperium he had labored to build. Yet even in destruction, Vulkan could not bring himself to eliminate everything. Tekel was permitted to preserve 7 artifacts, items deemed too valuable or significant to consign to the flames. These 7, combined with the gauntlet of the forge and Khazare's mantle that Vulkan wore to Istvan V, it would become the 9 artifacts of Vulkan, legendary relics that the Salamanders chapter would spend the next 10,000 years searching for across the galaxy. The fact that Vulkan chose to scatter these items rather than keep them with his chapter suggests he understood that his sons would need goals to pursue, that the search itself would give them purpose and direction in an age when their Primarch was absent. The creation of artifacts was for Vulkan not merely a technical exercise, but a meditative process. Working at the forge allowed him to think, to process experiences, to find clarity in the rhythm of hammer-striking metal. Unlike some of his brothers who found peace in meditation or prayer, Vulkan's spiritual practice was craftsmanship itself. The heat of the forge, the weight of the hammer, made the transformation of raw materials into finished products. These were his rituals. In creating weapons of beauty and power, Vulkan was not just making tools for war, but expressing something fundamental about his nature. He was the Primarch of fire and forge, and in the act of creation, he found meaning and purpose. The Horus heresy and Istvan V. The Horus heresy stands as the greatest catastrophe to befall the Imperium of man since its founding, a civil war of such magnitude that it would leave scars across the galaxy for 10,000 years and counting. When Warmaster Horus, the Emperor's favored son and the most accomplished of all the Primarchs, fell to the corruption of chaos and turned against his father, he took with him nearly half of the Space Marine legions and a significant portion of the Imperial Army and Mechanicum. Yet the betrayal shattered the Great Crusade, turned brother against brother, and came terrifyingly close to destroying everything the Emperor had built. For Vulkan and the Salamanders, the heresy began with whispers and ended in a massacre that would reduce his legion to a fraction of its strength and set him on a path of suffering that would test even his perpetual nature to its limits. The seeds of Vulkan's involvement in the heresy's darkest hours were planted years before Horus's betrayal became public knowledge. During the compliance action on the world designated 1546, also known as Karaatan. Vulkan had witnessed firsthand the brutal methods employed by Konrad Kurz and his Night Lord's Legion. What began as a joint operation to bring a human world into the Imperium's fold descended into an exercise in terror and atrocity, as Kurz's forces massacred entire cities to break the will of the population. The confrontation between Vulkan and Kurz over these tactics revealed fundamental incompatibilities in their worldviews, creating animosity between the two Primarchs that would later have terrible consequences. When Vulkan reported Kurz's conduct to War Master Horus, he sensed something troubling in Horus's response, a darkness that made the Salamander's Primarch instinctively withhold the gift of Dawnbringer he had intended to present. When the heresy erupted into open warfare, the initial moves by the traitors were calculated to eliminate loyalist forces that might threaten their rebellion. The massacre on Istvan III, where loyalist elements within the traitor legions were murdered by their own brothers, was merely the opening act. The true masterstroke came at Istvan V, where Horus laid a trap so perfect, so devastating, that it would cripple the loyalist response for years to come. 7 legions were dispatched to Istvan V to bring the traitors to heel, the Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands as the first wave, with the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and Word Bearers as the second wave, meant to cut off any retreat. What the Loyalists didn't know was that the second wave had already pledged themselves to Horus, and their true role was not to support the initial assault, but to slaughter the Loyalists once they were committed to battle. Vulkan led his Salamanders in the first wave, fighting alongside Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands and Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard. The 3 Primarchs were close, bound by friendship and mutual respect, and they coordinated their assault with the precision of brothers who trusted each other implicitly. The initial landing was opposed but manageable. The traitor forces appeared to be falling back in good order, drawing the Loyalists deeper into the kill zone. It seemed, for a brief moment, that the rebellion might be crushed quickly, that Horus's gambit had failed, and the traitors would be brought to justice. Then the trap was sprung. The Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and Word Bearers opened fire on their supposed allies from behind, catching the Loyalist legions in a devastating crossfire. At the same moment, the supposedly retreating traitor forces turned and counterattacked with renewed fury. The Loyalists found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and caught completely by surprise. What had been a coordinated assault became a desperate struggle for survival as 3 legions tried to fight their way out of a killing field designed specifically to destroy them. The artillery bombardment was apocalyptic, turning the drop site into a hellscape of fire and shrapnel where nothing could survive for long without cover. In the chaos of the massacre, Ferrus Manus made a fateful decision. Consumed by rage at the betrayal and determined to bring the traitors to account, he charged forward with his elite Morlock's Terminators toward the position where he could see the standards of Fulgrim's Emperor's children, and Vulkan called out to his brother to fall back, to consolidate their forces and attempt a fighting retreat, but Ferrus would not be deterred. The Iron Hands Primarch led his warriors straight into the jaws of the trap, where Fulgrim awaited him. The duel between the 2 Primarchs was brief and brutal, ending with Ferrus Manus being beheaded by the brother who had once been his closest friend. The loss of their Primarch broke the Iron Hands, scattering them across the battlefield in shock and grief. Vulkan and Corax tried to maintain some semblance of order among the shattered Loyalist forces, but the situation was hopeless. The traitors had overwhelming superiority in numbers and positioning, and they used it to methodically grind down the trapped legions. Salamanders died by the thousands, cut down by bolter fire, crushed by artillery, or falling in desperate melee combat against enemies who had once been brothers. Vulkan fought with the fury of a demigod, his Warhammer Dawnbringer rising and falling to crush traitor space marines, but even a Primarch could not be everywhere at once, could not stem the tide of destruction that was washing over his legion. Then came the nuclear strike. The Iron Warriors fleet in orbit, unleashed tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield, targeting areas of heavy salamander concentration. The atomic fires incinerated thousands of Vulkan's sons in an instant. Their ceramite armor, no protection against the temperatures, at the heart of nuclear detonations. Vulkan himself was caught in one of these blasts. The explosion that should have vaporized him. That would have killed any other being in the galaxy, save perhaps the Emperor himself. And his body was reduced to little more than carbonized bones and charred flesh. A corpse so damaged that identification would have been impossible, if not for the remnants of the Draken-scale armor still clinging to the remains. But Vulkan was a perpetual, and death, even death by nuclear fire, could not claim him permanently. His body began to regenerate, tissues knitting back together from nothing, bones reforming from ash and char. The process was agonizing and slow, but inexorable. As his consciousness flickered back into existence, Vulkan found himself surrounded by enemies. Hundreds of traitor space marines from the Iron Warriors and Night Lords had converged on his position, drawn by reports of a Primarch brought down by the nuclear strike. They meant to confirm the kill, to ensure that Vulkan would not rise again to threaten their forces. In his weakened state, still regenerating from wounds that would have killed anyone else, Vulkan fought with desperate fury. He killed dozens of traitors, even as they stabbed and shot him. His strength undiminished despite his injuries, but there were too many, and his body had not yet fully recovered. The traitors overwhelmed him through sheer numbers, stabbing, shooting, and bludgeoning him until he lost consciousness. When Vulkan awoke, he discovered that his unconscious form had been claimed by perhaps the worst possible captor, Konrad Kurza, his brother Primarch, who had never forgiven the humiliation of being reported for his conduct on Kuratan. What followed was months of torture that would have broken any other being, Primarch or not. Kurzi, and having learned from interrogating his captors that Vulkan was still alive, despite injuries that should have been fatal, began to experiment with how much damage the Salamander's Primarch could sustain. He killed Vulkan in every way his twisted imagination could conceive, waiting for each resurrection before trying a new method of murder. Beheading, evisceration, suffocation, burning, freezing, crushing, every form of death was inflicted multiple times. Kurzi did not torture Vulkan simply to cause pain, though he certainly enjoyed that aspect. He was trying to find a way to kill his brother permanently, to prove that even a perpetual could be destroyed if the correct method was found. But Kurzi's tortures had another purpose beyond experimentation. He wanted to break Vulkan's spirit, to prove that the humanitarian philosophy the Salamander's Primarch espoused was a weakness that would crumble under sufficient pressure. Every time Vulkan regenerated, Kurzi would mock him, tell him that his compassion for mortals was meaningless, that his attempts to protect the weak were futile in a galaxy that cared nothing for mercy or kindness. The Night Haunter wanted Vulkan to abandon his principles, to admit that Kurzi's nihilistic philosophy of terror and control was the only realistic approach to governance in a cruel universe. Day after day, death after death, Kurz tried to corrupt Vulkan's ideals, along with breaking his body. Yet Vulkan endured. His body regenerated from each death, and his will, tempered in the forges of Nocturne and hardened by decades of service to ideals larger than himself, refused to break. Yet he gave Kurzi no satisfaction, offered no renunciation of his beliefs, maintained his defiance even as he was killed again and again. This only enraged Kurzi further, driving the Night Haunter to ever more creative and brutal methods of murder. But still, Vulkan would not yield. The Salamander's Primarch understood something that Kurzi did not, that endurance itself was a form of victory, that by maintaining his principles even under unimaginable duress, he proved that those principles were stronger than any torture. Vulkan's escape came through a combination of chance and the intervention of forces working in the shadows of the heresy. The perpetual John Grammaticus, manipulated by the alien cabal who sought to use the heresy for their own purposes, had been tasked with permanently killing Vulkan using a weapon called the Fulgurite, a crystallized bolt of the Emperor's own psychic power. The Cabal believed that Vulkan's death was necessary for their plans, though exactly why they wanted him eliminated remained unclear. But before Grammaticus could deliver the fulgurite to Kurz, as the Cabal had instructed, events took an unexpected turn. During Vulkan's captivity, Kurz's ship had arrived in orbit around Macragge, the homeworld of Robut Guilliman and his ultramarines. Through means that remain somewhat mysterious, Vulkan managed to break free of his bonds during one of the torture sessions. He pillaged Guilliman's private armory for weapons, and then set out to hunt Kurzi through Macragge's cities, reversing their roles as predator and prey. The two Primarchs fought across an entire city, their battle causing massive collateral damage as superhuman beings clashed with apocalyptic fury. Vulkan, finally understanding the full extent of his perpetual nature and learning to focus his regenerative abilities, proved impossible for Kurzi to put down permanently. At one point, Kurzi shot Vulkan's head completely off, causing him to fall from a great height. Vulkan's body regenerated, and he was alive again before he even hit the ground. Their duel was interrupted by Grammaticus, who had been convinced by the Elder Farseer Eldrad Ulthran to use the fulgurite differently than the Cabal had instructed. Rather than giving the weapon to Kurz to kill Vulkan, Grammaticus stabbed Vulkan himself. The effect was catastrophic and unexpected. The fulgurite was indeed capable of killing a perpetual permanently, but only when wielded by another Primarch. When the human Grammaticus used it, the weapon instead caused a massive psychic explosion that killed them both. Grammaticus, being a perpetual himself, regenerated, but found that this was his final life, his own perpetual nature consumed by the weapon. Vulkan, however, did not regenerate. He lay dead, truly dead, his perpetual nature apparently ended by the Emperor's own power crystallized in the fulgurite. Vulkan's body was recovered by Robuta Guilliman, Sanguinius, and Lion L. Johnson when they came to Macragge. Guilliman crafted a stasis capsule specifically for his fallen brother, a work of art named the Unbound Flame, into which Vulkan's corpse was sealed. The few surviving salamanders who had made it to Macragge were allowed to stand vigil over their Primarch's body, though there was no expectation that he would ever wake. The salamanders had been essentially annihilated at Istvan V, reduced from a legion of tens of thousands to a few scattered companies. Their Primarch was dead, killed by a weapon that could end even perpetuals. It seemed that Vulkan's story had come to a tragic end, another casualty of the heresy's endless betrayals and horrors. But the story was far from over. Against all expectations, against the very nature of the fulgurite's power, Vulkan began to regenerate within his stasis capsule. The process took time, far longer than his previous resurrections, but his perpetual nature could not be permanently suppressed, even by the Emperor's own crystallized power. When Vulkan awoke, he found himself still on Macragge, but with no memory of how he had arrived in the stasis capsule, or what had happened during his death. What he did know was that his sons needed him, that the heresy still raged across the galaxy, and that his duty to the Emperor and the Imperium was not yet complete. The journey from Macragge back to Terra was a harrowing odyssey through the webway, the ancient Aeldari network of tunnels through the warp. Vulkan and a small group of salamanders, called the Draxward, fought their way through dark Eldar forces in satellite realms of Komorra, navigated abandoned sections of the webway infested with demons, and eventually emerged on Terra just as the siege of the Imperial Palace was reaching its climax. Vulkan's arrival could not have been more timely. The forces of Horus had breached the outer defenses and were pressing toward the Imperial Palace itself. Every loyalist warrior was desperately needed to hold the line. During the siege of Terra, Vulkan fought in numerous engagements, his massive form and unstoppable endurance making him a linchpin of the Imperial defense. One of his most significant battles was against Magnus the Red, his brother Primarch, who had fully embraced chaos and become a creature of the warp as much as of the material universe. Magnus was attempting to complete a ritual that would weaken the Emperor, making the ultimate prize of the siege more vulnerable to Horus's assault. Vulkan confronted him directly, and what followed was a battle that showcased both the power of a demon Primarch and the terrifying resilience of a perpetual. Magnus tried everything in his considerable arsenal to kill Vulkan. He beheaded him with a khopesh, transmuted his lungs to amber to suffocate him, drained all the blood from his body, and immolated him with psychic fire hot enough to reduce ceramite to vapor. After each apparent death, Vulkan would regenerate and continue pressing the attack, hammering away at Magnus's psychic barriers with relentless fury. The demon Primarch, for all his power, had limitations. His psychic might was vast, but not infinite, and maintaining his ritual while also fighting off an opponent who literally could not be killed permanently drained his reserves. Eventually, Vulkan broke through Magnus's defenses and delivered a blow that shattered the Crimson King's physical form, banishing him back to the warp and disrupting the ritual he had been attempting. At the climax of the Siege of Terra, when the Emperor, Sanguinius, Rogel Dawn, and a small force of custodians boarded Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, for the final confrontation, Vulkan made the decision to stay behind. As the last Primarch remaining on the ground, he commanded the final defense of the Imperial Palace against the traitor hordes still assaulting the walls. More importantly, he stood guard over Malkador the Sigillite, who was sustaining the Golden Throne in the Emperor's absence, and over the throne itself. This was not a role that would earn glory or be sung about in legends. It was a duty, pure and simple, and Vulkan undertook it without hesitation or complaint. The heresy would end with Horus's death aboard the Vengeful Spirit, but the Imperium that emerged from the Civil War was broken almost beyond repair, and half the Space Marine legions had turned traitor. The Emperor himself was confined to the Golden Throne, his physical form barely alive, his consciousness barely maintaining the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon that made interstellar navigation possible. Countless worlds had been destroyed, trillions had died, and the dream of the Great Crusade lay in ashes. For Vulkan, the heresy had cost him his legion, reduced to a shadow of its former strength. It had cost him his innocence, showing him that even Primarchs could fall to corruption. It had cost him his brotherhood, as half his siblings had turned traitor or died fighting them. What it could not cost him was his purpose or his values. Those he carried forward into the grim age that followed. And the beast arises and return. Following the conclusion of the Horus heresy and the Emperor's entombment upon the Golden Throne, the Imperium entered a period known as the Scouring, during which the Loyalist forces hunted down traitor remnants and attempted to restore some measure of order to the shattered domains of mankind. Vulkan participated in these campaigns for a time, his fury at the traitors who had brought such devastation to the Imperium, driving him to hunt those responsible with particular dedication. One of his primary targets was Fabius Bile, the mad apothecary of the Emperor's children, who had performed twisted experiments on captured loyalists during the heresy. Vulkan's attempts to find and kill Bile became something of an obsession, though the wily Chaos Space Marine proved elusive, but always slipping away before the Salamander's Primarch could corner him. Eventually, like his brother Leman Russ of the Space Wolves, Vulkan made the decision to leave his legion. The exact timing is unclear from surviving records, with some sources suggesting he led the Salamanders for 3 full millennia after the heresy before departing, though evidence of his deeds during that period is scarce. What is known is that when Vulkan departed, he told his sons that he would return in the end times, echoing Russ's own prophecy about his eventual return. This was not abandonment, but rather a promise, an assurance that when humanity's need was greatest, their Primarch would return to fight alongside them once more. With that pronouncement, Vulkan vanished from Imperial records, leaving the Salamanders to continue their duty without him while maintaining faith in his promised return. For 1,500 years, there was no verified sighting of Vulkan anywhere in the galaxy. The Imperium during this period, known as the 32nd Millennium, enjoyed relative peace and prosperity compared to what had come before and what would come after. The devastation of the heresy had been largely repaired. The traitor legions remained scattered and broken, confined to the Eye of Terror and other regions of chaos-tainted space. Xenos threats existed, but were contained at the frontiers. The stagnation and decay that would define the Imperium in later millennia had not yet fully set in. It seemed, for a brief historical moment, that humanity might actually recover and perhaps even thrive in the Emperor's absence. This period of relative stability ended in the year 544 of the 32nd millennium, when the Imperium encountered what would become known as the War of the Beast. A massive greenskin horde, larger than any ever recorded, emerged from the galactic fringe and began rampaging across Imperial space. The warlord leading this horde became known simply as the Beast, and he was like no greenskin the Imperium had faced before. This was a creature as large as a Primarch, possessed of intelligence and cunning that belied the brutish reputation of its species, capable of speaking Gothic and coordinating complex military operations across multiple sectors simultaneously. The Beast commanded technology that seemed impossible for greenskins, including massive space stations called attack moons that could teleport across the galaxy and lay waste to entire worlds with their weaponry. The scale of the Beast's invasion eclipsed even the greenskin horde that the Emperor himself had defeated on Ullanor during the Great Crusade, the victory that had earned Horus the title of War Master. The green tide swept across the Imperium with a speed and coordination that caught the Imperial military completely off guard. Entire sectors fell before the Imperium could mount effective resistance. Space Marine chapters were destroyed, attempting to halt the advance. The political leadership on Terra descended into infighting and paralysis, the High Lords of Terra more concerned with their own power struggles than with mounting a coordinated defense against an existential threat. As the situation grew increasingly desperate, with the Beast's forces actually laying siege to Terra itself, and one of the attack moons entering orbit around humanity's throne world, the Imperium's defenders needed every advantage they could find. It was in this context that the Inquisition received reports of a single massive warrior fighting against greenskins on the world of Caldera. The descriptions matched no known space marine, but seemed to fit the legends about Primarchs. When Lord Commander of the Imperium Corland, one of the last survivors of the Imperial Fists and their successor chapters, learned that this might be Vulkan returned, he immediately led an expedition to Caldera to investigate. What they found exceeded their hopes. It was indeed Vulkan, fighting a one-man war against the greenskin forces besieging Caldera. The Primarch had been defending this world personally, killing greenskins by the hundreds, holding back the green tide through sheer individual prowess. When Corland approached and asked Vulkan to return to Terra and lead the Imperium's defense, the Primarch refused. He had made a vow long ago to the people of Caldera that he would never allow their world to fall to flame and destruction. He would not break that vow, not even to save Terra. First, Caldera had to be saved. Understanding that Vulkan could not be swayed from his chosen duty, Corland committed the forces he had brought to helping defend Caldera. Together, they assaulted the source of the greenskin invasion of the world, an attack moon that was in the process of being constructed in orbit. Vulkan led the assault personally, fighting his way to the moon's power generation system. Using his immense strength and the weapon he had forged for this campaign, Doom Tremor, Vulkan destroyed the generator, causing a chain reaction that shattered the attack moon and saved Caldera from destruction. His vow fulfilled, Vulkan agreed to return to Terra with Corland. The Primarch's arrival on Terra caused a sensation. Here was one of the Emperor's own sons, returned from legend to save the Imperium in its hour of need. Vulkan took command not through force or political maneuvering, but through simple moral authority. The squabbling High Lords fell silent when the Primarch spoke. The scattered Imperial forces, demoralized and disorganized, rallied at the news that a Primarch had returned to lead them. Vulkan did not waste time with recriminations or purges of incompetent leadership, though he certainly could have justified such actions. Instead, he focused entirely on organizing the defense and preparing a counter-offensive against the Beast. Vulkan made clear from the beginning that his return was temporary. He had not come back to rule the Imperium, or to permanently resume command of the salamanders. He had returned for this specific crisis, to face this particular threat, because the beast represented an existential danger to humanity's survival. When the beast was defeated, Vulkan indicated, he would depart once more, returning to whatever purpose had occupied him during his long absence. This was not the return prophesied for the end times, but rather an earlier intervention driven by the immediate magnitude of the threat. Whilst the Primarch officially led the crusade to Ullanor, the beast's homeworld, though in practice he left most of the tactical and strategic details to Khorland, giving the Lord Commander his full support while remaining somewhat isolated in his chambers aboard the Fist's exemplar battle barge, Alcazar remembered. Vulkan spent this time working on Doomtremor, making adjustments and preparations that suggested he knew exactly what kind of fight awaited him at the Crusade's end. When the Imperial fleet arrived at Ullanor and began the assault on the greenskin capital city of Gorkogrod, Vulkan remained in his chambers until the crucial moment. Then he leapt into action, leading the final charge into the beast's massive temple gargant, and a walking war machine the size of an Imperator Titan that served as both fortress and mobile headquarters for the greenskin warlord. Khorland and the other commanders quickly realized that Vulkan intended to fight the beast alone. This was not pride or a desire for personal glory, but rather practical recognition that the battle between a Primarch and a greenskin warlord of the beast's size and power would be too dangerous for anyone else to survive in proximity. Khorland ordered an evacuation as the two giants clashed in the heart of the temple gargant. What followed was a battle that defied description, two beings of immense size and power fighting with apocalyptic fury, while the temple gargant shook and groaned around them, its structure damaged by their combat. The fight drove them deeper into the war machine's interior, and until they reached the massive power generator that kept the temple gargant functioning. In the final moments of their duel, Vulkan tackled the beast directly into the generator. The energies contained within that device included massive amounts of psychic power, the gestalt field that greenskins generate, and that empowers all their technology and their reality warping abilities. These energies, concentrated and raw, began to flood into Vulkan as he grappled with the beast. Rather than being consumed by these alien psychic forces, Vulkan's own savage essence, his indomitable will, allowed him to become one with the power. He channeled it, mastered it, and used it to fuel one final devastating attack. Vulkan raised Doomtremor and brought the massive hammer down into the beast's face with the full force of his strength, enhanced by the very energies that had powered the greenskins' horde. The impact was devastating, but Vulkan did not stop there. Even as the beast's skull shattered under the blow, the Primarch detonated the power generator itself, triggering a chain reaction that obliterated the entire temple gargant. The explosion was visible from orbit, a pillar of fire and force that consumed everything within kilometers of the temple. When the smoke cleared, both the beast and Vulkan were gone, apparently destroyed in the catastrophic blast. The Imperium presumed Vulkan dead. Lord Commander Khorland stated that the Primarch's sacrifice would be remembered forever, that Vulkan had given his life to save the Imperium from a threat that might have doomed humanity. Memorial services were held, his name added to the rolls of honor alongside the other fallen Primarchs. But the Salamanders, alone among all the Imperial forces, maintained that their Primarch still lived. They had faith that as a perpetual, Vulkan could not truly die, that he would regenerate even from complete molecular disintegration caused by a power generator explosion. Whether he did in fact survive, where he went if he regenerated, and what he has been doing in the thousands of years since the War of the Beast remains one of the great mysteries of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The War of the Beast had demonstrated that Vulkan's promise to return in the end times was not an empty oath. When faced with a crisis that threatened the Imperium's very existence, the Primarch had emerged from wherever he had been and thrown himself into the fight without hesitation. He had taken command, rallied the defenders, and ultimately sacrificed himself to eliminate the threat. This established a pattern, a hope that the Salamanders cling to across the millennia, that Vulkan will return again when humanity's need is greatest. Each generation of salamanders lives with the expectation that they might be the ones to fight beside their Primarch when he returns for the final battle. The 9 artifacts and the prophecy. Before departing for Istvan V to confront Horus's rebellion, Vulkan made a decision that would echo across 10,000 years of imperial history. He returned to Prometheus, at the Moon of Nocturne, where the salamanders maintained their primary fortress monastery, and met with his first Forge Father, a salamander named Tekel. In that meeting, Vulkan revealed something that troubled him deeply. He had created thousands of weapons and artifacts over his long life, works of incredible power stored in vast vaults beneath Prometheus. Many of these creations were too dangerous to exist in a galaxy where even Primarchs could fall to corruption. If Horus, the greatest and most trusted of all the Emperor's sons, could betray everything they had fought for, then any weapon might eventually be turned to evil purposes, regardless of its creator's intentions. Vulkan ordered Tekel to destroy the contents of the vaults. All the masterworks, all the artifacts of terrible power, and all the weapons that represented centuries of craftsmanship and genius were to be consigned to the forges and reduced to molten metal. It was a command that devastated Tekel, who saw in those works the living legacy of his Primarch. These were not mere weapons, but expressions of Vulkan's art, pieces that should be preserved for future generations. But Vulkan was adamant. Better to destroy his life's work than risk those creations being used to bring about even greater catastrophes than the heresy had already unleashed. Yet even Vulkan could not bring himself to order the destruction of everything. He permitted Tekel to save 7 artifacts from the flames, items deemed too valuable or too significant to be destroyed. These 7 items, combined with the gauntlet of the forge and Kesari's mantle that Vulkan wore to Istvan V, would become known as the 9 artifacts of Vulkan. But they would not remain together in a vault on Prometheus. At some point after the heresy, approximately 1,000 years after the Emperor's entombment on the Golden Throne, Vulkan scattered these 9 artifacts across the galaxy, hiding each one in a different location, protecting them with different challenges and guardians. The Tome of Fire, a collection of texts and devices that Vulkan left with the salamanders, contained encrypted clues to the locations of the 9 artifacts. This was not a simple treasure map, but rather a complex puzzle that would require investigation, interpretation, and no small amount of luck to decipher. The exact nature of each artifact's location and the challenges protecting it were locked within riddles and passages that might take years or even decades to understand. Vulkan had deliberately made the quest difficult because he intended it to serve multiple purposes. First, and most obviously, scattering the artifacts ensured they could not all be captured at once if one storage location was compromised. If all 9 had remained in the vaults on Prometheus, and those vaults were raided, the consequences could have been catastrophic. By distributing them across the galaxy, Vulkan ensured that recovering them would require a sustained effort across many decades or centuries, and that the loss of one would not mean the loss of all. Second, and perhaps more importantly, Vulkan created the quest as a test for his Genesons. Yet he wanted to see if the salamanders were worthy of wielding these powerful artifacts, if they had the determination, wisdom, and purity of purpose to undertake such a difficult and long-term mission. The institution of the Forge Father was created specifically to pursue this quest. A captain from one of the Salamander's companies, selected by the chapter's Pantheon Council for his exceptional qualities, would renounce his original name and take the name Vulkan, becoming the Forge Father. This individual would dedicate the rest of his life to searching for the missing artifacts, following the clues in the Tome of Fire across the galaxy, fighting whatever enemies stood between him and the relics, and ultimately returning each recovered artifact to the chapter's custody on Prometheus. But the position of Forge Father was not meant to be easy or glorious. Most who held it would search for decades without success, would follow false leads and dead ends, would fight battles in obscure corners of the galaxy that no one would remember or celebrate. Yet the role was considered the highest honor the salamanders could bestow, a recognition that the bearer was the best among them in all aspects of warfare, and possessed the mental and spiritual strength to continue pursuing an apparently impossible goal for the rest of his life. The Forge Father understood that he would probably die without completing his quest, that he was just one link in a chain that might stretch across centuries before the final artifact was recovered. But he accepted this burden willingly, driven by faith that his efforts mattered, that each clue deciphered and each artifact recovered brought the chapter closer to the day when Vulkan would return. Of the 9 artifacts, 5 have been recovered over the 10,000 years since Vulkan scattered them. The first to be found was the Chalice of Fire, a massive forge ship discovered drifting in space during the 41st Millennium by Forge Father Vulkan Dirzan. The ship had been breached, its vault raided by unknown enemies who had stolen the artifacts it contained, but the vessel itself remained intact. The Eye of Vulkan, a powerful laser weapon capable of annihilating ships in orbit, was still mounted on the Chalice of Fire and was recovered along with the ship. Both the Chalice and the Eye now serve the salamanders from orbit above Prometheus, and the forge ship providing weapons and equipment for the chapter, while the laser serves as an orbital defense platform. The Spear of Vulkan, that legendary weapon that burned with heat capable of melting ceramite, was eventually recovered and is currently wielded by Vulkan Hastan, the Forge Father at the time of the 41st Millennium. The spear is as devastating as the legend suggested, able to burn through even the heaviest armor and deliver wounds that cauterize instantly from the intense heat. Kasare's mantle, the cloak woven from firedrake scales, was also recovered and is worn by Hestan as part of his war gear. The mantle provides exceptional protection and serves as a symbol of the Forge Father's connection to Vulkan and to Nocturne's traditions. The Gauntlet of the Forge, that armored gauntlet incorporating a heavy flamer that Vulkan wore as part of his Draken scale armor, was recovered by Vulkan Hestan personally after he defeated the Elder Pirate Lord Iath Bloodweaver in single combat. The gauntlet allows Hestan to project gouts of flame while keeping his hands free for other tasks, making him even more formidable in close combat. Hestan bears these 3 artifacts: the Spear of Vulkan, Kasare's mantle, and the Gauntlet of the Forge, at all times as he continues his quest to find the 4 remaining relics. 4 artifacts remain missing, their locations still encrypted within the Tome of Fire. The Obsidian Chariot, described in fragmentary records, but whose exact nature and capabilities remain unclear. The Song of Entropy, and a name that suggests some kind of sonic or reality-warping weapon, but about which little concrete information exists. The Engine of Woes, another artifact known only by name and reputation. And finally, the Unbound Flame, described as a device both terrible and wondrous. Interestingly, Unbound Flame was also the inscription on Vulkan's stasis capsule, the one Rabuta Gilliman crafted to hold his apparently dead brother after the incident on Macragge. Some have speculated that the 9th artifact is not an object at all, but rather Vulkan himself, that the Unbound Flame is the living Primarch who will return when all the other artifacts have been recovered. The prophecy that drives the Salamander's quest states that when all 9 artifacts are finally assembled, if Vulkan will judge whether his gene sons have been sufficiently tempered by their trials to be worthy of his leadership. If they have proven themselves, the Primarch will return to lead them in the final war against the enemies of humanity, the apocalyptic conflict that will determine whether the Imperium survives or falls to darkness. This prophecy gives the Salamanders hope in an age when hope is perhaps the rarest commodity in the galaxy. No matter how dark the present, no matter how desperate their current struggles, they maintain faith that their Primarch will return. The quest for the artifacts continues in the dying years of the 41st Millennium, and for the first time in history, the Salamanders are not alone in their search. Several of their successor chapters from the Ultima founding, the new generation of Primaris Space Marines created from Vulkan's genetic legacy, have joined the hunt. The Covenant of Fire and the Hammers of Nocturne have deployed multiple companies to the search, while other chapters have sent smaller forces. This expansion of the quest demonstrates how critical the salamanders consider the mission, that they are willing to dedicate substantial military resources to an objective that might take decades or centuries to complete. Recently, Vulkan Histan journeyed to a world known as Zero, following clues that suggested the unbound flame might be hidden there. What he found, if anything, has not been revealed in available records, but the fact that the Forgefather pursued this lead personally suggests it was considered particularly promising. Each new clue, and each fragment of information that brings the salamanders closer to understanding the Tome of Fire's riddles, is treated as a major breakthrough. The recovery of even one more artifact would be celebrated as a triumph and would bring the chapter one step closer to the prophesied return of their Primarch. The 9 artifacts represent more than just powerful weapons or valuable relics. They are symbols of Vulkan's connection to his gene sons across the millennia, tangible proof that the Primarch has not forgotten them even in his long absence. They are tests that challenge the salamanders to prove themselves worthy of their heritage, and they are promises that Vulkan will return, that the quest will eventually be completed, and that the chapter will once again fight alongside their Primarch as they did in the days of the Great Crusade. And in a galaxy where certainty is scarce and the future grows darker with each passing year, the artifacts and the prophecy they represent give the salamanders something precious, a reason to believe that better days may yet come. Comparisons with other Primarchs. Understanding Vulkan's place among his brother Primarchs requires examining how he compared to them across various domains. The 20 Primarchs created by the Emperor were all superhuman, all capable of feats that would seem impossible to normal humans, but they were not identical in their capabilities. Each had areas where they excelled and areas where they were competent but not exceptional. Vulkan's unique combination of traits made him unlike any of his brothers, his strengths and weaknesses creating a profile that was distinctly his own. In terms of pure physical strength, but the question of who was the strongest Primarch has been definitively answered in the lore. Vulkan was the most physically powerful of all his brothers. The evidence for this is overwhelming and comes from multiple sources. During the Great Crusade, one of the salamanders noted that with Ferrus Manus dead, Vulkan was unarguably the strongest Primarch, suggesting that before Ferrus's death at Istvan V, the two had been close competitors for that title. The fact that Vulkan could match the Emperor himself in tests of pure physical strength during their contest on Nocturne, with many trials ending in draws, speaks to the incredible power contained in his massive frame. Ferrus Manus, the Primarch of the Iron Hands, was indeed the only brother who approached Vulkan in raw strength. Ferrus had wrestled with the Emperor during their first meeting, a contest that lasted for days and caused such disruption that it leveled mountain ranges on Medusa. His metallic arms, transformed by plunging them into the molten blood of a dragon-like creature, gave him strength that exceeded even normal Primarch capabilities. Yet, even Ferrus himself acknowledged that Vulkan was his equal, or possibly superior, in physical might. The two had a mutual respect born of recognizing the same qualities in each other, the strength of will and body that set them apart from most of their siblings. Other Primarchs known for their physical prowess included Leman Russ, the Wolf King of the Space Wolves, and Angron, the broken gladiator who led the World Eaters. Russ was a savage warrior whose strength was legendary, is capable of feats like breaking Magnus the Red's back by lifting and slamming the Crimson King with brutal force. Angron, especially after the Butcher's nails were implanted in his brain, and later when he ascended to become a demon Primarch, possessed terrifying physical might, enhanced by constant rage and pain. Yet neither could match Vulkan in pure lifting strength or ability to apply force. Vulkan could overturn Space Marine battle tanks, could bend the barrel of artillery pieces with his hands, could tear through armored bulkheads like they were paper. This was strength on a scale that exceeded even what other Primarchs could manage. However, physical strength alone does not determine combat effectiveness. In terms of martial skill and fighting ability, while Vulkan was formidable, but not necessarily the supreme combatant among his brothers. That distinction generally went to Primarchs like Sanguinius, the angelic lord of the Blood Angels, who combined strength with speed, skill, and precognitive abilities that made him perhaps the most dangerous Primarch in single combat. Lemon Russ and Lionel Johnson were both considered among the very best fighters, their prowess honed by years of conflict and natural aptitude. Even Conrad Kersey, despite being weaker than Vulkan, was a terrifying opponent due to his precognitive visions and absolutely ruthless fighting style. Vulkan's combat approach was straightforward and relied heavily on his physical advantages, but he used massive weapons that other Primarchs would struggle to wield effectively and trusted in his strength and endurance to overcome opponents. This made him extremely effective against enemies who tried to match him in direct confrontation, but potentially vulnerable to more tactical or agile fighters who could avoid his attacks while landing their own. His perpetual nature meant that even if an opponent could defeat him in a single engagement, killing him permanently required methods that few possessed. This made Vulkan perhaps the hardest Primarch to actually eliminate, even if he wasn't impossible to defeat in any given fight. In terms of tactical and strategic ability, Vulkan was competent, but not exceptional compared to some of his brothers. Primarchs like Reboot Gilliman, Lionel Johnson, and Rogel Dawn were renowned for their military genius, able to coordinate campaigns across entire sectors and manage the logistics of million-strong armies with ease. Vulkan could command effectively, and his forces performed well under his leadership, but he did not display the same level of strategic brilliance that made Gilliman the Lord Commander of the Imperium, or allowed the Lion to win victories that seemed impossible. Vulkan's approach to warfare was methodical and thorough, rather than brilliant or innovative, focusing on achieving objectives with minimal collateral damage rather than seeking the most efficient path to victory. Where Vulkan truly stood apart was in his craftsmanship and technical ability. Only Ferrus Manos, and perhaps Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, could rival Vulkan's skill at creating weapons and technology. While Ferrus had his own legendary abilities as a smith and artificer, and the two had a friendship based partly on mutual respect for each other's technical expertise. Perturabo's abilities leaned more toward grand engineering projects and siege works than personal craftsmanship, but his understanding of technology was profound. Yet even among this elite company, Vulkan's creations were recognized as extraordinary. The weapons he forged for his brothers, the artifacts that would become legendary across millennia, demonstrated a level of skill that possibly exceeded even Ferrus's considerable abilities. Perhaps the most significant difference between Vulkan and his brothers was his perpetual nature. He alone among the Primarchs, aside from the Emperor himself, possessed true immortality. But this set him fundamentally apart from all his siblings and gave him a perspective that they could not share. While they knew they could die, that their existence could be ended by sufficient force or the right circumstances, Vulkan knew that death was always temporary for him. This knowledge shaped his actions and his philosophy in ways both obvious and subtle. He could take risks that would be suicidal for others, knowing he would return. He witnessed the deaths of his brothers, knowing they were permanent in ways his own deaths could never be. This made him perhaps the loneliest of all Primarchs, doomed to outlive everyone he cared about. In terms of compassion and humanity, Vulkan was exceptional among his brothers. Sanguinius shared some of this quality, maintaining connection to the common people and showing genuine care for their welfare. Vulkan, however, made humanitarian concern the very foundation of his legion's philosophy. Where most Primarchs viewed civilians as resources to be managed or obstacles to be cleared, Vulkan saw them as the very purpose of the Great Crusade, the people the Imperium was supposed to protect and elevate. This made him beloved by common citizens in ways that most Primarchs were not, even those who were respected or feared. Some Primarchs were more effective leaders in the political sense. Horus's charisma made him the obvious choice for War Master, able to coordinate disparate forces and inspire loyalty across the entire Great Crusade. Gilliman's administrative genius made him effectively the ruler of his own mini-empire within the larger Imperium. The Lion's authority was absolute and unquestioned among his dark angels. Vulkan's leadership style was more personal and less political, based on the example he set and the values he embodied, rather than charisma or administrative capability. His sons followed him out of love and respect, rather than programmed loyalty or fear, which created a different kind of bond, but one that was not necessarily more effective at achieving military objectives. The question of who was the most powerful Primarch overall is complicated, because power takes so many forms. Magnus the Red, before and especially after his fall to chaos, possessed psychic might that could reshape reality and destroy armies with a thought. Horus, when empowered by all four chaos gods, became strong enough to nearly kill the Emperor himself. And demon Primarchs like Mortarion and Fulgrim gained abilities beyond anything their mortal forms possessed. But in his own domain, physical strength and supernatural resilience, Vulkan was supreme, a being of such power that even other Primarchs had to acknowledge his superiority in this area, combined with an immortality that made him ultimately unkillable by any conventional means. What made Vulkan truly remarkable was not that he was the best in any single category, but rather the combination of exceptional physical gifts with unusual compassion and dedication to his values. He was not the smartest Primarch, not the most charismatic, not the most tactically brilliant, and not the most skilled fighter. But he was the strongest, the most durable, among the best craftsmen, and perhaps the most humane. This combination created a Primarch who embodied a different vision of what the Emperor's sons could be, one focused on protection and service rather than conquest and glory. Among 20 extraordinary beings, Vulkan was unique, and it is this uniqueness that makes him perhaps the most beloved Primarch among the Imperium's common citizens, even 10,000 years after he disappeared from known history. Legacy and impact on the Imperium. In the dying years of the 41st millennium, 10,000 years after the Horus heresy tore the Imperium apart, and more than 9,000 years since Vulkan was last definitively seen fighting the beast on Ullanor, the question of the Primarch's current status remains one of the great mysteries of Imperial history. Unlike some of his brothers, whose fates are known with certainty, whether fallen to chaos or confirmed dead, Vulkan exists in a unique liminal state. He is neither proven alive nor confirmed deceased, and his perpetual nature means that even apparent death cannot be accepted as final. The Salamanders chapter maintains absolute faith that their Primarch lives, that he will return when all 9 of his artifacts are recovered and the Imperium's need reaches its ultimate crisis. Whether this faith is justified or merely a comforting belief that helps the chapter maintain hope in dark times is a question that may not be answered until the end times arrive. The Salamanders. Chapter that exists in the 41st millennium is a direct reflection of Vulkan's philosophy and values, but preserved across hundreds of generations of space marines who have never met their Primarch, but who nevertheless embody his teachings. They remain one of the few Astartes chapters that actively maintains ties to civilian populations, that values the protection of innocents as highly as the destruction of enemies, that sees themselves as guardians rather than simply warriors. In an age where the Imperium has become grotesquely authoritarian, and human life is valued less than the ammunition expended to end it, the Salamander's humanitarian approach is an increasingly rare anomaly. The chapter's organization and culture reflect Nocturnian traditions that Vulkan established during the Great Crusade. Unlike most Space Marine chapters that forbid their warriors from maintaining contact with their pre-recruitment lives, the Salamanders encourage their members to retain connections to the communities they came from. Many Salamanders maintain homes on Nocturne where they return between campaigns, living among the normal citizens of their homeworld, rather than isolating themselves in the fortress monastery. This is almost unheard of in other chapters, where the transformation from human to Astartes is meant to be total and absolute, erasing the person who was and replacing them with a living weapon. The Salamanders believe, as Vulkan taught, that remembering one's humanity makes one a better protector of humanity. The craftsmanship traditions Vulkan established remains central to Salamander's culture. Every battle brother is expected to master some form of technical skill, whether that is weaponsmithing, armor maintenance, or some other craft. They maintain and repair their own equipment personally, seeing it not as a chore, but as a sacred duty and a way to connect with their Primarch's legacy. The chapter's artificers are renowned throughout the Imperium for the quality of their work, creating weapons and armor that are masterpieces of function and form. When a salamander goes to war, he carries equipment he has personally maintained or even created, understanding its capabilities intimately because he has worked on every component himself. The Promethean Creed, that philosophical framework Vulkan developed combining Nocturnian beliefs with his own teachings, continues to guide the chapter. The concept of the circle of fire, of transformation through trial, of death leading to rebirth, these ideas give meaning to the endless warfare that defines the Space Marine existence. These salamanders see each battle as a forge in which they are tested and tempered, becoming stronger through adversity. They believe that in death they return to the elements, that their sacrifice has meaning beyond simply eliminating enemies. This spiritual dimension, unusual among Space Marine chapters that typically embrace the Emperor's supposed atheism, gives the salamanders a sense of purpose that extends beyond mere obedience to orders. The battle cry "Vulkan lives" echoes across battlefields whenever the salamanders fight, a declaration of faith that their Primarch has not truly left them. Those two words carry weight beyond their literal meaning. They affirm the values Vulkan taught, the belief that strength should protect rather than oppress, that compassion and ferocity can coexist, and that the Imperium is worth defending because of the people it protects rather than for its own sake. When a salamander shouts "Vulkan lives" while charging into combat, he is not just expressing hope for his Primarch's return, but committing himself to living according to the principles Vulkan embodied. The quest for the 9 artifacts continues to be the defining mission for the chapter, consuming resources and attention that other chapters might devote to different priorities. The Forge Father and those who accompany him on his searches represent significant military capability that is not available for deployment to crisis zones or active war zones. Yet the Salamanders consider this an acceptable cost, believing that recovering the artifacts and enabling Vulkan's return is more important than any number of smaller victories. This long-term perspective, this willingness to sacrifice immediate tactical advantage for a strategic goal that might not be achieved for centuries, demonstrates how deeply Vulkan's teachings have shaped his Gene-Son's thinking. The legacy Vulkan left extends beyond his own chapter to influence the wider Imperium, though often in ways that are not immediately obvious. The humanitarian approach to warfare that seems radical in the 41st millennium was actually closer to the Emperor's original vision for the Great Crusade than the brutal efficiency that became standard practice. Vulkan represented what the Imperium might have been if the heresy had never happened, if the dream of enlightenment and prosperity had not been drowned in blood and betrayal. Every world the Salamanders defend, yet every civilian population they save when other chapters might have abandoned them to their fate, is a small victory for the values Vulkan championed against the darkness that has consumed so much of the Imperium. There are those who speculate about what Vulkan's return would mean for the Imperium. In an age when Reboot Guilliman has returned from stasis to serve as Lord Commander once more, when the possibility of Primarchs returning is no longer theoretical but proven, the question of whether other loyalist Primarchs might emerge from wherever they have been becomes more pressing. Vulkan's perpetual nature means he cannot be truly dead, only absent. If he did survive the explosion that destroyed the beast, if he regenerated even from that catastrophic destruction, then he is somewhere in the galaxy, in pursuing some purpose that has kept him from returning to his chapter or the Imperium he helped build. The mystery of the unbound flame, the 9th artifact that might be Vulkan himself, suggests that the Primarch's return may be contingent on his Gene-Sons proving themselves worthy. This would be consistent with Vulkan's philosophy, his belief that challenges test and improve those who face them, that easy victories teach nothing but struggle, builds character. If Vulkan is waiting for the salamanders to find all the artifacts before returning, he is giving them a goal that requires dedication across centuries, cooperation across successor chapters, and the kind of persistence that defines his own character. The quest becomes a forge in which the entire chapter is tempered, and made ready for whatever role they will play in the final conflicts that await. Vulkan's absence has itself become a defining characteristic of the Salamander's identity. They are the chapter whose Primarch will return, the warriors who maintain hope and faith across millennia of darkness. This separates them psychologically from chapters whose Primarchs are confirmed dead or fallen to chaos. The Salamanders do not mourn a loss, but rather anticipate a reunion. They prepare for the day when Vulkan will return, maintaining his teachings and values, so that when that day comes, he will find his gene sons worthy of his leadership. This orientation toward the future, rather than the past, gives the chapter a different character than many others, focused on what is to come, rather than what has been lost. In the broader context of Imperial history and lore, Vulkan represents something essential about what the Imperium was meant to be. He was the Emperor's vision of strength in service of protection, of power wielded responsibly, of warriors who remembered why they fought rather than simply becoming machines of war. The fact that this vision has largely failed, that the Imperium has become the oppressive, authoritarian nightmare that Vulkan would barely recognize, makes his legacy all the more poignant. He stands as a reminder of what was lost when the heresy destroyed the Emperor's dream, and what might still be reclaimed if the Imperium can find its way back to those original principles. The impact of Vulkan on Warhammer 40,000 lore extends beyond the fiction to influence how fans engage with the setting. As he is one of the most beloved Primarchs, precisely because he represents hope and humanity in a universe that often seems devoid of both. Players who field Salamander's armies on the tabletop are making a statement about valuing protection over destruction, about believing that even in the grim darkness of the far future, there can be warriors who fight for something more than mere survival or dominance. Vulkan's humanity, his compassion combined with his strength, makes him aspirational in ways that more pragmatic or brutal Primarchs cannot match. Whether Vulkan lives in the conventional sense, whether he will return to lead the Salamanders in the apocalyptic conflicts that seem to be approaching as the 41st Millennium draws to a close, these questions remain unanswered, but in a deeper sense, Vulkan does live. He lives in the values his gene sons uphold, in the civilians saved by Salamanders who remember their duty to protect the weak, in every weapon forged with care and skill in the chapter's workshops, in the faith that keeps hope alive even in the darkest hours. The Primarch may be absent, but his legacy endures, a flame that cannot be extinguished no matter how hard the darkness presses in. So we say, with the Salamanders, with certainty born of faith rather than evidence, Vulkan lives. And in living, through the deeds of those who remember and honor him, he remains the strongest Primarch, not just in body, but in spirit, the enduring example of what the Emperor's sons were meant to be, and what they still might become if the Imperium can reclaim the vision that Vulkan never abandoned, even across 10,000 years of absence. If you enjoyed learning about Vulkan and the Salamanders, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into Warhammer 40k lore. Let me know in the comments which Primarch you'd like to hear about next, and I'll see you in the next video.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.